We need a clear, unequivocal statement of what the U.S. objective is in Iraq. Is it weapons of mass destruction? Is it regime change? Is it return of Bahraini prisoners? What is it? What responsibility, if any, do we have? What is the President's vision for what Iraq will look like after Saddam is gone? If, as I've said before, if Saddam Hussein is around 5 years from now, we have a serious problem.
President Obama and I, and nearly all of our partners and allies, are convinced that President Assad, a tyrant, hell-bent on clinging to power, is no longer fit to lead the Syrian people, and he must go.
A dictator bent on rebuilding an empire. Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia, for free people refused to live in a world of hopelessness and darkness. We will have a different future, a brighter future, rooted in democracy and principle, hope and light, of decency and dignity, of freedom and possibilities. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power. God bless you all, and may God defend our freedom.
When it comes to regime change, the Vice Biden rarely appears to find one that he opposes, almost consistently calling on regime change once every 10 to 12 years. The first Gulf War in 1991 may have been the final time that Biden has opposed regime change, or for that matter, war. 2 years after his opposition to the first Gulf War, and in the midst of the Bosnian War, Senator Biden criticized European nations for not becoming more involved in the war, calling their abstinence moral rape. European policy is based on cultural and religious indifference, if not bigotry. I think it's fair to say that this would be an entirely different situation if the Muslims were doing what the Serbs have done. The truth of this is not lost on the Islamic world. Years later, what the Muslims did while working as CIA assets was revealed. Weapons flown in during the spring of 1995 were to turn up only a fortnight later in the besieged and demilitarized enclave at Srebrenica. When these shipments were noticed, Americans pressured UN Profor to rewrite reports, and when the Norwegian officials protested about the flights, they were reportedly threatened into silence. The secret services of Ukraine, Greece, and Israel were busy arming the Bosnian Serbs. Near 30 years after Senator Biden lashed out at varied countries across the continent, the U.S. President traveled halfway across Europe, landing in Warsaw, Poland.
I came to Europe again this week with a clear and determined message for NATO, for the G7, for the European Union, for all freedom-loving nations. We must commit now to be in this fight for the long haul. We must remain unified today and tomorrow and the day after, and for the years and decades to come. It will not be easy. There will be cost, but it's a price we have to pay, because the darkness that drives autocracy is ultimately no match for the flame of liberty that lights the souls of free people everywhere.
This coup had been the CIA's safest kind of operation, political intervention. Roosevelt and a handful of CIA men changed the government by organizing revolution on the streets.
A brief history of U.S.-backed regime change include the quarter-century rule of Iranian dictator Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the 17-year rule of Augusto Pinochet, Chilean dictator, Saddam Hussein, Iraqi dictator, who for his own reasons held fake elections, Hosni Mubarak, Egyptian dictator, owning elections, the US-backed Hamid Karzai and his drug-trafficking brother in Afghanistan, Operation Enduring Freedom, and one of the latest, Muammar Gaddafi, Libyan dictator to Libyan martyr. Russian President Vladimir Putin was outraged over the regime change in Libya. one of those years he was actually not the president of Russia in late 2011. In all of these regime changes, the situation has gone from bad to worse.
Has Egypt been betrayed by the West?
Yes, the whole country is
In what
betrayed
sense?
by the West. And I hope that the day will come when you will discover that you have made the bet on the wrong factions in this country.
Egypt, now ruled by a military dictatorship. All because of when Muslim Brotherhood member Mohammed Morsi took power after a 2011 coup. It introduced a constitution backed by the United States, while at the same time practicing an Saudi-type butchery against citizens for free speech.
President Barack Obama called President-elect Morsi to congratulate him and promised the United States will continue to support Egypt's transition to democracy.
The endless cycle of violence in Iraq, where U.S. troops are still deployed 16 years after Saddam Hussein's death. Only days after the president's regime change comments, Biden seems to back off.
Number one, I'm not walking anything back. The fact of the matter is I was expressing the moral outrage I felt toward the way Putin is dealing and the actions of this man. Just expressing my outrage. He shouldn't remain in power. Just like, bad people shouldn't continue to do bad things. But it doesn't mean we have a fundamental policy to do anything to take Putin down in any way. Because I was talking to the Russian people. The last part of the speech was talking to the Russian people, telling them what we thought.
But what is happening for the president's support at home? In April of 22, with Americans feeling the sting of inflation, the U.S. president's ready explanation for the cause of this inflation was not a result of the president's economic policies, but instead the Putin price hike.
Putin's invasion of Ukraine has driven up gas prices and food prices all over the world. The two largest grain producers in the world, Ukraine and Russia, are not doing what they usually do, so everything's going up. We saw today's inflation data. 70% of the increase in prices in March came from Putin's price hike in gasoline. We need to address this challenge.
Trying to label this Putin's price hike. But most Americans, according to an NBC News poll, are not buying that. Only 6% blame Putin. Most believe President Biden's policies are very much to blame.
Even U.S. President number 44, Barack Obama, came out in support of his former vice president. And even Obama conceded it was, in fact, the Putin price hike that was the cause of U.S. inflation.
I heard the same arguments after I came back from meeting with Milosevic. We can't act. We can't send troops there. Where we can, America must. Why?
Never very popular, in 2008, Joe Biden, in the race for Democratic nomination for President of the United States, only about 1% of voters supported him. In fact, for Senator Biden, Super Tuesday, out 8, was an absolute slaughter. Previous President Donald John Trump seemed to have difficulty maintaining a competent White House staff, among many other issues. President Joe Biden, only a few years older than Trump, sometimes appears to be completely lost. During the race for the White House, Biden was being interviewed by CBS News regarding some of these very noticeable issues.
Please clarify specifically, have you taken a cognitive
No,
test?
I haven't taken the test. Why the hell would I take a test? Come on, man. That's like saying before you got in this program, you take a test where you're taking cocaine or not. What do you think, huh?
Refusal to take the test made some suspect that the former vice president was on the mental decline and attempting to hide it, being propped up by his powerful friends in Washington and by the media. Some Republicans seized upon these issues, considering if a cognitive test should be required for those who hold the office of the president. Of course, these measures were never considered by this very party when many of the same questions arose around their candidate and former president, Donald John Trump. Old age, while not necessarily a disqualifying factor when it comes to most voters, at the same time, some have always believed that when an elected official is on the mental downslope, the people have a right to know. In 2017, Donald John Trump became the oldest president ever inaugurated in United States history. 4 years later, Joe Biden broke that record. More than 30 years earlier, the record holder for the oldest president ever inaugurated was President number 40, Ronald W. Reagan. Nearing the end of his first term, many questioned the intelligence of President Reagan. This became a serious debate in 1984, as the St. Petersburg Times reports by asking a troubling question: is President Reagan stupid? The article, written by Charles Stafford on 4 March of that year, speaks of the conference by the American Enterprise Institute, described as a political think tank consisting of various lobbyists, broadcasters, authors, and ex-politicians, to name a few. The primary question was the Reagan administration and the press. What's the problem? In response to President Reagan's sometimes puzzling behavior. In this conference in 1984, it consisted of 6 men: Sam Donaldson of ABC, Lou Cannon of the Washington Post, Jack Landau of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, what the paper describes as 2 old Reagan hands, David Gergen, and consultant Lynn Nafziger, along with a pro-Reagan author named Victor Lasky. ABC's Sam Donaldson recalls a time when, in a discussion with Reagan spokesperson Larry Speaks, Donaldson reported that Speaks said, "You don't tell us how to stage the news, we don't tell you how to cover it." Donaldson, during the conference, states that when discussing this story, "Wrong. This administration tells us what we can and cannot cover, and has been more successful, in my view, than any other administration since I have been in Washington." Lynn Nafziger charged the press with setting one standard for the president and another for itself.
They have been saying that the press has a right to know. I have not been able to find that in the law. I have not been able to find that in the Constitution. They have the right to find out. They do not have the right to know. They demand honesty, as they should, integrity, as they should, responsibility, as they should, and no mistakes from the president or the government. They hold government accountable when it falls shy, as they should. But we see very little effort on the part of the press to hold itself accountable for honesty, for responsible reporting, for no mistakes. It will be a lot more effective in making its point to the American people if it holds the mirror up to itself and asks itself if it is indeed living up to the standards as the self-appointed watchdog, the self-appointed representative of the people that it demands of others.
Lou Cannon of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press stated, "They've got in this president one of the most popular, likable, decent presidents who's ever served in that office. And they also have a president who, on many issues, doesn't know too much. When you have a president who basically people like, but who isn't very knowledgeable about a lot of things, and then you try to emphasize his skills and hide his weaknesses, and that is what these people are trying to do." Sam Donaldson chimed in with, "I won't say he's an amnesiac, but he really can't remember. He is decent, he is jovial, but he says things that aren't true, makes up stories." Lynn Nafziger stated, "I've watched Ronald Reagan for 18 years now. I don't think he's dumb. I've watched him in press conferences. I think if you go in and you talk to the president, listen to him,
you'll find that he's generally pretty much on top of things. Because the press is not getting the response it wants, or because he is not the kind of president that they are accustomed to, does not mean that he is an incompetent president. Naturally, years later, President Reagan's Alzheimer's diagnosis would be made public. So the point is, it was clear to any fair-minded individual more than 30 years ago that something was mentally wrong with the President of the United States. And they were right. The President Biden gaffes, slip-ups, and brain cramps
That obligation does not extend to NATO, to Ukraine.
have caused some international concern. President Joe Biden seemed like a man being propped up even before entering the White House. In this clip, Joe Biden, accompanied by his wife, Dr. Jill Biden, when a protester, armed with a piece of paper, ran up to the stage. The doctor, wife of Joe Biden, immediately went after the protester. Meanwhile, the 47th Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden, appears not only to hide behind his wife, but makes for certain that the protester does not get in between him and his wife, almost pushing his wife forward towards the paper-waving interloper. Dr. Jill Biden showing more courage than the soon-to-be President of the United States. For all the Biden family military bluster, this can be viewed as an act of cowardice.
And we're going to provide a pathway for 11...
Another incident viewed the now elected president getting lost on the way to the White House. Puzzling behavior by the President of the United States, going to a building he spent 8 years in previous and was being directed to by his own Secret Service, which for whatever reason he seemed to completely ignore. The physical condition of the president became an issue when boarding Air Force One for a routine flight. The President of the United States slips and falls on the red carpeted stairway 3 separate times.
Are you a junkie? 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 Are you a junkie?
Weeks before Biden's inauguration, an event occurred in Washington that made the 2001 protest against soon-to-be President George W. Bush look like a tamed and peaceful event. An opinion piece in USA Today with a provocative, nose-thumbing title. Sorry, progressives, but Biden isn't doing that bad. Remember Trump? This might come as a surprise, but I'm not a Biden fan. I hate his 1994 crime bill. I don't like his pushback against forgiving student loans, and I am ashamed at how he pulled out of Afghanistan. Explaining that not every president can be inspirational by adding that anyone is better than Trump. Perhaps by mistake, the writer mentions that Biden is a man who has studied the science of government. He has dedicated his life to public service. Someone who dedicates their life to public service could be viewed as a career politician.
Policy established by the IRS in the Nixon administration denying tax exemption to private schools.
Joe Biden became a United States Senator during the second regime of President Richard Nixon. He only vacated his seat in 2009 when he became the 47th Vice President of the United States, occupying the Senate for over 35 years.
Obligation freely.
Without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion.
Without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion.
Career politicians, particularly in the United States, are known for a few things: accepting bribes
engaging in backroom deals, and throwing around one's own political power. Pessimistic as it may sound, the former vice president explained how he was instrumental in the dismissal of a local Ukrainian prosecutor, publicly bragging about it later. Backroom deals that involved the president's son with Ukrainian business executives, and whatever money may or may not have changed hands. Hunter Biden has had a long string of troubles since 2014. It was that year when the younger Biden was booted out of the U.S. military for the smoking of crack cocaine. It was also that year when the younger Biden was placed on the board of directors of a Ukrainian natural gas company. Over the years, many alleged the former vice president, running foreign policy in Ukraine, while his son enjoys a cushy position he is ill-qualified for. Moreover, the company, Burisma, like too many other entities in Ukraine, received accusations of corruption at its highest levels. An investigation was initiated by Viktor Shokin, a Ukrainian prosecutor general, reported in October of 19. Pressure from the former vice president, Joe Biden, the IMF, and the European Union made for certain the prosecutor's ousting. Understanding the former vice president's reason for wanting the investigation quashed and the prosecutor fired is one thing. They were investigating the company in which his son was on the board of directors. Booted out of the U.S. military for the smoking of crack cocaine was still a huge issue. Hunter Biden could not be permitted to disgrace the family again. So Joe Biden's interference, while unacceptable, is understandable. But why would the International Monetary Fund and European Union pressure Ukraine to get rid of this local prosecutor at the time when he's investigating corruption? The Ukrainian Anti-Corruption Action Center stated that Shokin was not investigating. He did not want to investigate Burisma, and Shokin was fired not because he wanted to do that investigation, but quite to the contrary, because he failed the investigation. With interference from the U.S. Vice President and IMF and European Union, compounding that with an already corrupt government investigating itself. And no evidence of wrongdoing was found on the part of Hunter Biden. This, of course, was after the prosecutor was fired and replaced by a new prosecutor who was told to drop the case, which he promptly did. Only a year out of his Burisma scandal, the vice president's son made headlines again, or at least his laptop, and the information it yielded. Hunter Biden did, in fact, introduce his vice president daddy to Ukrainian gas company executives. Hunter Biden, after crashing a rental car, was in possession of a crack pipe, according to the New Yorker. Once a whiz kid, going high places. Now seen here with a crack pipe in his mouth. A sad contrast to earlier days. In an interview years later,
I spent more time on my hands and knees, picking through rugs, smoking anything that even remotely resembled crack cocaine.
And as far as Hunter Biden goes, he used to be a crackhead, but now he's not. But why does Hunter Biden matter at all when it comes to the Russian war against Ukraine? A president, or as the elder Biden was at the time, a vice president, pulls special favors to get his son a cushy, high-paying position with a foreign company for which the son is ill-qualified. Within a year, an investigation into this foreign company is launched, but due to interference from the former vice president and IMF and European Union, an investigation dealing with corruption is quashed. An investigation began under the new anti-corruption legislation, something that the United States insisted on back in 2015. Almost as if the president, Joe Biden, is protecting the personal interest of a country and a company he has personal interest in.
The atrocities that the Russians are engaging in are just beyond the pale. And the cost of the fight is not cheap, but caving to aggression is even more costly.
You take all the troops out, you better have helicopters ready to take those 3,000 civilians inside the green zone where I've been 7 times and shot at. You better make sure you have protection for them or let them die, number one. So you can't leave them there. And it's going to take a minimum of 5,000 troops to 10,000 just to protect our civilians. So while you're taking them out, Governor, take everybody out. That may be necessary.
Only months before Senator Obama picked the future president as his vice presidential running mate, the Delaware senator looked to pass drug legislation relating to crack cocaine. The Morning Star from 13 February, out 8, states, U.S. Senator Joe Biden said there is growing support in Congress for revising a 22-year-old law that sets far harsher federal penalties for crack cocaine, which is more likely to be used by blacks than powder cocaine. When it came to his own family, the president seems to take a different approach, choosing drug rehab over prison. The key is federal legislation passed in 1986 in response to a growing and violent crack epidemic that imposed harsher sentences for that form of the drug, which is smoked, than for the powder, which is usually sniffed. Crimes involving 5 grams of crack draw the same sentence as simple crack possession. And depending on the content of what was in the pipe, it was Hunter Biden who may have been in simple crack possession. In late April of 22, the New York Post reports, President Biden on Tuesday issued 3 pardons and 75 prison sentence commutations, reported as his first grants of clemency since taking the office. His first grants of clemency due to his unpopularity. All of the commutations and 2 of 3 pardons went to people convicted of federal drug offenses. A Biden official stated that Biden understands that too many people are serving very long sentences for non-violent drug crimes, so he's using his clemency power as a way to try and address that. Or maybe the president just saw his approval rating.
I think this presents us with some significant...
Then there was the 21st of March of 22 New World Order speech given by President Biden at a business roundtable discussion.
Every 3 or 4 generations. As one of the top military people said to me in a secure meeting the other day, 60 million people died between 1900 and 1946. And since then, we established a liberal world order, and that hadn't happened in a long while. A lot of people dying, but nowhere near the chaos. And now is a time when things are shifting. There's going to be a new world order out there, and we've got to lead it. And we've got to unite the rest of the free world in doing it. So anyway, I'm going to hush up Mary. Now they've launched and refocused their campaign to seize new territory in eastern Ukraine. And we're in a critical window now of time where they're going to set the stage for the next phase of this war.
President Biden's eagerness to involve the United States in another foreign war that has little to nothing to do with U.S. interest. Despite most major press, constant praise of the United States economy and job numbers, President Biden himself has lost massive popularity since elected.
Responsive to Ukraine's needs and tailored to support
a new war in a new country.
Which is a different war than in other places because both topographically it's different. It's flat, it's not in the mountains, and it requires different kinds of weapons to be more effective.